The hiring committee at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad looked at her application and saw a problem. Excellent grades from Cornell's civil engineering program. Strong recommendations. Clear competence in mathematics and structural analysis. But she was a woman. In 1920, that disqualified her from serious consideration for engineering positions. The committee rejected her application. She applied again. They rejected her again. She applied a third time with a revised strategy. She wouldn't ask to be a railroad engineer. She'd ask to be a draftsman. Lower pay, lower status, but it got her in the door. 2 years later, Olive Dennis was the Baltimore and Ohio's chief engineer of service, designing the innovations that would transform American passenger rail travel. The barriers facing women in early 20th century railroad engineering weren't subtle or ambiguous. They were explicit, institutional, and reinforced by both formal policy and informal exclusion. Engineering schools admitted few women. Railroad companies hired fewer. The Baltimore and Ohio had never employed a woman in its engineering department before Dennis applied. The idea that a woman could contribute to railroad design was considered somewhere between improbable and absurd by the men who made hiring decisions. Dennis understood this perfectly well. She'd spent enough time in academic and professional environments to know exactly what she was up against. Her response wasn't to challenge the system directly or demand fair treatment on principle. Her approach was more pragmatic. Accept whatever position they'd offer. Prove indispensable through actual work, then expand from there. The draftsman job was a compromise that got her inside the organization. Once inside, she could demonstrate competence that couldn't be dismissed. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1920 faced competitive pressure from automobiles and intercity buses. Passenger traffic, once a reliable revenue source, was declining as Americans discovered they could travel by car without dealing with train schedules, transfers, or the general inconvenience of rail travel. Railroad executives recognized the problem but struggled to identify solutions. Their focus remained primarily on operational efficiency, faster schedules, better on-time performance, improved mechanical reliability. These were important, but they weren't what was driving passengers away. Olive Dennis saw the issue differently. She'd traveled extensively by train as a student and professional. She'd experienced the discomforts that railroad management seemed not to notice or consider important. Hard seats designed for durability rather than comfort. Poor ventilation that left passengers breathing coal smoke and stale air. Inadequate lighting that made reading difficult. Restrooms that ranged from barely functional to genuinely unpleasant. The railroad industry had spent decades optimizing trains for freight and operational efficiency while treating passenger comfort as an afterthought. Her position as draftsman gave her access to design processes without authority to change them. She drafted plans that other engineers specified. Learning the technical requirements and constraints of railroad car design while noting every decision that prioritized cost or simplicity over passenger experience. After 2 years of proving she could handle technical work as competently as her male colleagues, she approached management with a proposal. Create a position focused specifically on improving passenger service through better design. The proposal shouldn't have worked. Railroad companies didn't typically create new engineering positions based on junior employee suggestions. But Dennis made a business case rather than an ideological argument. She documented the revenue impact of declining passenger traffic, identified specific comfort issues that surveys showed passengers complained about most frequently, and proposed concrete design modifications with cost estimates. She wasn't asking for philosophical change. She was offering a solution to a measurable problem that was costing the company money. In 1921, the Baltimore and Ohio created the position of Engineer of Service and gave it to Olive Dennis. The title deliberately avoided the word chief initially, but the scope was unprecedented. She would have authority to redesign passenger car interiors with a mandate to improve comfort and convenience. The railroad's president, Daniel Willard, was willing to try something unconventional because conventional approaches weren't working. If a woman engineer thought she could improve passenger experience, she'd get a chance to prove it. Dennis started with ventilation. Railroad cars in 1921 relied on windows for air circulation, which meant passengers chose between stuffiness and coal smoke, depending on whether windows were open or closed. She designed a ventilation system that drew fresh air through filters and distributed it through the car while exhausting stale air, creating continuous circulation without exposing passengers to smoke. The system added cost to car construction, but it solved a problem passengers had complained about for decades. Next came lighting. Standard railroad car lighting used ceiling-mounted fixtures that provided general illumination but created shadows that made reading difficult. Dennis designed individual reading lights at each seat, positioned to eliminate shadows without bothering adjacent passengers. The modification required additional wiring and fixtures, increasing costs, but it addressed passenger surveys showing that poor lighting was a frequent complaint. Seating got a complete redesign. Railroad seats traditionally prioritized durability and space efficiency, resulting in hard benches that became uncomfortable after an hour. Dennis worked with manufacturers to develop seats with improved cushioning and back support, accepting reduced seat density in exchange for passenger comfort. The railroad could carry fewer passengers per car, but Dennis argued that comfortable passengers were more likely to choose rail over automobile travel, potentially increasing total revenue even with reduced capacity per car. The restroom redesign demonstrated her willingness to tackle problems that male engineers seemed embarrassed to discuss. Railroad restrooms were notoriously unpleasant, cramped, poorly ventilated, inadequately cleaned. Dennis redesigned them with better ventilation, improved lighting, and easier cleaning access. She specified materials that could be cleaned effectively and layouts that gave passengers more space. The improvements cost money and reduced seating capacity, but they addressed one of the most common reasons passengers cited for preferring automobile travel. Each innovation required convincing skeptical managers that passenger comfort justified the expense. Dennis responded with data. She conducted surveys, analyzed revenue trends, and documented the relationship between comfort improvements and passenger satisfaction. When dining car usage increased after she redesigned dining spaces with better lighting and ventilation, she highlighted the revenue impact. When sleeper car bookings rose after mattress improvements, she quantified the financial return. The broader railroad industry watched the Baltimore and Ohio's experiment with a woman engineer with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some railroads considered Dennis's work irrelevant. They believed rail travel competition was about speed and price, not seat cushions. Others saw potential but doubted whether the improvements justified the costs. A few began quietly implementing similar changes, usually without crediting Dennis or acknowledging that a woman had pioneered the innovations. By 1930, Dennis had become something railroad management hadn't anticipated, a competitive advantage. The Baltimore and Ohio's passenger cars were demonstrably more comfortable than competitors. Passenger surveys showed higher satisfaction. Revenue data showed people choosing Baltimore and Ohio when alternative routes were available. The company promoted her innovations in advertising, though they were careful about how explicitly they mentioned that the designer was a woman. Some marketing materials highlighted her work while being vague about her gender, presumably to avoid alienating passengers who might object to riding trains designed by a woman. Dennis's influence extended beyond the Baltimore and Ohio. Other railroads began hiring women in service-related engineering positions, usually in roles focused on passenger amenities rather than core mechanical engineering. The pattern was notable. Railroads were willing to accept women working on soft engineering problems like interior design and passenger comfort, but remained resistant to women in positions involving locomotive design or track engineering. The barrier had moved, but it hadn't disappeared. The work took a personal toll. Dennis remained unmarried, later noting in interviews that combining marriage with her career would have been impossible given social expectations of the era. She faced continuous skepticism from male colleagues who resented taking direction from a woman or questioned whether her innovations were actually valuable. Railroad trade publications generally ignored her work or credited it to male supervisors. She received professional recognition eventually. Election to the American Railway Engineering Association in 1930 made her the first woman member. But the recognition came years after male engineers with similar accomplishments would have received it. The passenger rail industry's decline after World War II rendered many of Dennis's innovations obsolete. As Americans shifted to automobiles and airlines, railroads reduced passenger service and focused on freight. The comfortable passenger cars Dennis designed were retired or sold off. By the time she retired in 1951, passenger rail was a declining business, and the improvements she'd pioneered mattered less than they had in the 1920s and 1930s. What survived was the precedent. Olive Dennis proved that a woman could work as a railroad engineer, that focusing on passenger experience could improve financial performance, and that innovations dismissed as frivolous by male engineers could create measurable competitive advantage. She didn't break down all the barriers facing women in railroad engineering. Those barriers remained substantial for decades after her retirement. But she demonstrated that competence could overcome institutional resistance if you were strategic about how you challenged it. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad eventually merged with other systems, and most physical traces of Dennis's work disappeared as old passenger cars were scrapped. What remains is the documentation of what she accomplished and the evidence that passenger-focused design improvements she pioneered became industry-standard practice, even if the industry didn't always acknowledge where those practices originated.